His mother died poisoned by a friend. His father never cared about him. At his mother's funeral, crying, he shouted, "God, why have you abandoned me?" The gray sky hung over the cemetery like a pall of sadness, reflecting Ethan's state of mind. He stood before the freshly covered grave, his red, swollen eyes fixed on the marble headstone that now marked his mother's final resting place. The engraved words seemed to mock him. Amanda Collins, beloved mother and friend. Friend. The word echoed in his mind, reminding him of all the times his mother had been more than just a mother figure. She had been his confidant, his rock, his beacon in the darkness. And now, she was gone. Around Ethan, a small group of people dressed in black murmured words of comfort, but they sounded distant and empty. He felt isolated, as if he were trapped in a bubble of pain that separated him from the rest of the world. His eyes wandered around the cemetery, past the familiar faces of relatives and friends, all with expressions of grief. Suddenly, a memory invaded his mind. His mother smiling, the summer sun lighting up her face as she taught him to ride a bike. The contrast between that happy memory and the cruel reality of the present was too much for Ethan to bear. God, why have you abandoned me? The cry escaped his lips before he could stop it, echoing through the silent cemetery. Heads turned in his direction, their gazes a mixture of compassion and discomfort. Sarah, his best friend since childhood, stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Ethan," she said softly, "your mother hasn't abandoned you. She will always be with you, in your heart." Ethan looked at her, wanting to find comfort in her words, but something in her eyes made him hesitate. There was a shadow there, something he couldn't decipher. For the first time, he wondered if he really knew Sarah as well as he thought he did. After the ceremony was over and people began to disperse, Ethan remained motionless, unable to move away. Sarah stayed by his side, her presence both comforting and unsettling. "You don't have to be alone tonight," she offered. "I can stay with you if you like." Ethan shook his head slowly. "Thanks, Sarah, but I think I need some time alone." She nodded, understanding, but Ethan noticed a flash of, what? Disappointment? Relief? It passed so quickly that he wasn't sure he really saw it. "All right," she said. "But call me if you need anything, okay?" Ethan agreed distractedly, his thoughts already turning back to his mother. As Sarah walked away, he couldn't help noticing how empty her words of comfort sounded, as if she was reciting lines from a script rather than speaking from the heart. The drive home was a blur. Ethan barely remembered driving, his mind a whirlwind of memories and unanswered questions. When he finally reached the house where he grew up, it seemed strangely silent and empty. He wandered through the rooms, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Every object, every photograph on the wall was a painful reminder of his mother. In the kitchen, he could almost smell her favorite cookies. In the living room, the sofa where they used to sit together to watch movies seemed impossibly large and empty. It was in his mother's bedroom that Ethan finally stopped. Hesitantly, he opened the door, greeted by the familiar scent that still hung in the air. His eyes roamed around the room, absorbing every detail as if trying to imprint everything in his memory. It was then that he noticed something on the bedside table. A small leather-bound book worn by time and frequent use. His mother's diary. Ethan picked up the book with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the unread words. He knew his mother kept a diary, but had never thought to read it. Now, however, it seemed to be the only connection he had left with her. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Ethan opened the diary, the yellowed pages crackling under his fingers. The first entries were trivial, notes about the weather, small everyday events. But as he read on, something changed. His mother's words became darker, more urgent. "There is a secret in our family," one entry read. "A dark secret that I fear may one day reach Ethan. I must protect it no matter the cost." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. What was this secret? And why had his mother never mentioned anything? He read on, his mother's words painting an increasingly disturbing picture. There were mentions of people Ethan didn't know, places he had never heard of, and again, references to an unspecified danger that always seemed to be lurking. One entry in particular caught his attention. "Sarah came to see me today. She's scared, and rightly so. I can't blame her for what she's done, but I'm afraid the consequences of her actions may be more serious than any of us could have imagined." Ethan reread the passage several times, his mind spinning. Sarah? His Sarah? What could she have done that would frighten her mother so much? He closed the diary, feeling suddenly suffocated. The walls of the room seemed to be closing in on him, and he needed air. Stumbling, Ethan left the house, inhaling deeply of the cold night air. As he gazed at the stars above, Ethan felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his mother, about Sarah, about his own life, suddenly seemed uncertain. One thing was clear, however. There was much more to his mother's death than he had initially thought. And Sarah, his best friend and confidant, was somehow at the center of it all. Ethan clenched his fists, a fierce determination replacing the pain in his heart. He was going to find out the truth no matter what the cost. He owed it to his mother. As the night wore on, Ethan remained in the garden, his grief slowly turning into a search for answers. The shadows around him seemed deeper, more threatening, as if the secret mentioned by his mother was materializing around him. Somewhere in the city, Sarah looked out of the window, her own thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and fear. She knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The stage was set for a journey that would test not only Ethan and Sarah's friendship, but also the very foundations of love, trust, and loyalty on which Ethan had built his life. The echoes of betrayal were only just beginning to resonate, and the coming storm promised to change everything forever. The morning sun seeped through the gaps in the shutters, forming dancing patterns on Ethan's bedroom floor. He hadn't slept. His eyes, red and tired, were fixed on his mother's diary, which rested on his lap like a weight impossible to ignore. The revelations of the night before echoed in his mind, mingling with the memories of a childhood that now seemed to belong to someone else. Who really was Amanda Collins? And what did Sarah have to do with all this? Ethan stood up, feeling every muscle in his body protest. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start his search. Sarah's house was only a few blocks away. Ethan walked slowly, trying to organize his thoughts. The suburban neighborhood, with its well-kept houses and verdant gardens, seemed surreally normal considering the whirlwind in his mind. Arriving at the door of Sarah's house, Ethan hesitated. His hand hovered over the doorbell for a moment before finally pressing it. The seconds that followed seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The door opened, revealing Sarah. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Ethan, a mixture of surprise and fear. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't expect to see you so soon. How are you?" Ethan studied his childhood friend's face, looking for signs of the person his mother's diary had hinted at. "I need to talk to you, Sarah. It's important." She nodded, opening the door wider to let him in. The house was silent. Sarah's parents had probably already left for work. "Let's go to my room," Sarah suggested, leading Ethan up the stairs. Sarah's room was exactly as Ethan remembered it. Walls covered in band posters, a messy desk full of books and papers, and the old armchair where they used to sit and talk for hours. "What did you want to talk about?" Sarah asked, taking a seat on the edge of the bed. Ethan remained standing, unable to get comfortable. "I found my mother's diary last night," he began, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. For a moment, he saw a flash of panic cross her face, quickly replaced by an expression of forced curiosity. "Oh? And what did it say?" "There were strange things in it, mentions of a family secret, of danger." Ethan paused, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "And your name was there." Sarah paled visibly. "My name? I don't understand. What exactly did it say?" "That you looked for her, scared. That you did something, Sarah. Something that could have serious consequences." Ethan took a step forward. "What did you do? What's going on?" Sarah stood up abruptly, turning towards the window. Her shoulders were tense, her hands trembling slightly. "Ethan, I don't know what you're talking about. Your mother must have gotten confused, or maybe... Don't lie to me." Ethan's voice rose, the frustration and pain finally boiling over. "My mother is dead, Sarah. Dead. And now I find out that there are secrets, dangers. I need to know the truth." Sarah turned around slowly, tears shining in her eyes. "Ethan, please. There are things it's better not to know. Things that could hurt you." "Hurt me? More than I'm already hurt?" Ethan laughed bitterly. "What could be worse than losing my mother and finding out that my whole life may have been a lie?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah seemed to be fighting an internal battle, her eyes moving rapidly as if looking for a way out. Finally she spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "There's a box. In the attic. Your mother asked me to guard it a few years ago. She said it was important, but dangerous." Ethan felt his heart racing. "Show me." Sarah hesitated for a moment before nodding reluctantly. She led Ethan up to the attic, a dusty space full of boxes and old furniture. In the far corner, partially hidden by a sheet, was a carved wooden box. With trembling hands, Sarah removed the sheet and opened the box. Inside, Ethan found a mixture of seemingly random objects: old photos, documents, a small notebook, and at the bottom, a yellowed envelope addressed to Sarah. Ethan picked up the envelope, his eyes widening as he recognized his mother's handwriting. "Why would my mother write a letter to you and hide it here?" Sarah hesitantly held out her hand. "Ethan, maybe we should..." But Ethan was already opening the envelope, his eyes quickly scanning the written lines. As he read, his face went from confusion to shock and finally to disbelief. This can't be true," he muttered, letting the letter fall from his trembling hands. Sarah picked up the letter, reading it quickly. Her face paled even more. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Ethan, But Ethan was already walking away, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The letter suggested a connection between Sarah and his mother that went far beyond what he could ever have imagined. It spoke of shared secrets, imminent dangers, and a promise made years ago. "Did you know about this all along?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling with anger and pain. "All these years you..." "No!" Sarah exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. "I swear, Ethan, I didn't know any of this. Your mother never told me." But Ethan couldn't listen any longer. The feeling of betrayal was overwhelming. He ran downstairs, ignoring Sarah's desperate calls. When he reached the street, Ethan took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. The revelation of the letter had shaken the foundations of everything he believed he knew about his life, his mother and Sarah. As he walked home, Ethan knew that his search for the truth had only just begun. The pieces of the puzzle were there, hidden in the pages of his mother's diary, in the objects in the mysterious box, and in Sarah's unspoken words. He looked up at the sky, the clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen of the storm to come. Ethan knew he couldn't stop now. He would get to the bottom of this story, no matter how painful the truth might be. As the day progressed, Ethan found himself delving deeper and deeper into the mystery surrounding his mother's life and death. Each new discovery seemed to raise more questions than answers, and the shadow of betrayal hung over every interaction, every memory. Sarah tried to call several times, but Ethan ignored every call. He wasn't ready to face her, not while his mind was still spinning with the day's revelations. Sitting in his room, surrounded by the objects in the box and the scattered pages of his mother's diary, Ethan felt more alone than ever. The only thing driving him was his determination to find out the truth, no matter what the cost. As night fell over the city, Ethan made a silent promise to his mother's memory. He would unravel this mystery, face the ghosts of the past, and finally understand the true meaning of love and trust. The journey would be long and painful, but Ethan was prepared to face it. For deep in his heart, he knew that only through the truth could he find the peace he so desperately craved. Dr. Marcus's office was an oasis of calm in the midst of the chaos that had become Ethan's life. The walls in soft shades of blue, the diffused light and the gentle buzz of the water fountain in the corner of the room created an atmosphere that invited introspection. Ethan sank into the soft leather armchair, feeling the weight of the last few days pressing down on his shoulders. Dr. Marcus, a middle-aged man with kind eyes framed by thin-rimmed glasses, watched Ethan intently. "How are you feeling today, Ethan?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Honestly, like my whole world has been turned upside down, and the worst thing is that I don't know who to trust anymore." The therapist nodded understandingly. "It's natural to feel this way after such a significant loss. You mentioned in our last session that you were having difficulty processing your mother's absence. How has that been evolving?" Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories flow. "It's strange. Sometimes I feel as if she's still here. Other times, the reality of her absence is so overwhelming that I can barely breathe." He paused, his voice becoming lower. "And now, with everything I've discovered, it's like I'm losing her twice." "What do you mean, everything you've discovered?" Dr. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his professional curiosity piqued. Ethan hesitated. He hadn't yet shared the details of his mother's diary or the mysterious box in Sarah's house with anyone. But the weight of these secrets was becoming unbearable. "I found my mother's diary," he began, the words coming out hesitantly at first, but soon gaining strength. "There were things in there, secrets, mentions of dangers I didn't even know existed. And Sarah, my best friend, is somehow involved in all of it." Dr. Marcus listened intently as Ethan unraveled the web of mysteries and betrayals he had uncovered over the past few days. When Ethan finally stopped talking, exhausted, the therapist remained silent for a few moments, processing everything he had heard. "Ethan," he began carefully, "sometimes, when we face such a profound loss, our mind looks for explanations, reasons to justify the pain we're feeling. Is it possible that you're interpreting your mother's words through this lens of pain and confusion?" Ethan shook his head vehemently. "No, doctor. I know what I read. I know what I saw in Sarah's eyes when I confronted her. There's something going on, something my mother was trying to protect me from." Dr. Marcus nodded slowly. "I see. And how do you feel about your father at the moment? You mentioned before that he's been emotionally absent since your mother's death." The mention of his father made Ethan cringe involuntarily. "My father? He's there physically, but it's as if a part of him died along with my mother. He barely speaks, barely eats. It's like living with a ghost. This emotional absence must be difficult for you, especially at this time." Ethan felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. "Difficult? It's more than difficult. It's like I've lost them both at once. I need him now more than ever, and he's just not there. Dr. Marcus made a note on his pad before looking at Ethan again. Have you considered that this absence of your father may be shaping your current view of love and trust? The question hit Ethan like a punch in the gut. He had never made that connection before, but now that Dr. Marcus had mentioned it, it seemed painfully obvious. I guess so, he admitted slowly. I always saw my parents as this perfect couple, you know. And now, seeing my father like this, it's like all the love they shared meant nothing in the end. Grief affects people in different ways, Ethan, Dr. Marcus explained gently. Your father's reaction doesn't diminish the love he felt for your mother, or for you. Sometimes the pain is so great that people close themselves off as a form of self-protection. Ethan nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt for having judged his father so harshly. I understand, but it still hurts. Of course it hurts. And it's okay to feel that pain, Ethan. The important thing is not to let it completely define your view of love and relationships. When the session ended, Ethan left the office feeling emotionally exhausted, but also with a new perspective. Dr. Marcus's words echoed in his mind, mingling with the revelations of the last few days. Arriving home, Ethan went straight to his bedroom, where his mother's diary still rested on the bedside table. He picked it up, feeling the familiar weight of the book in his hands. With a deep sigh, he opened it again. This time, instead of looking for secrets and conspiracies, Ethan concentrated on the entries that talked about everyday moments, the small joys, the daily worries, the dreams for the future. Gradually, a fuller picture of his mother began to form in his mind. One entry in particular caught her attention. Today, Ethan had a high fever. I spent the whole night by his bedside, praying for him to get better. Seeing my son suffer is the worst pain I've ever felt. I would do anything to protect him, to keep him safe and happy. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing by keeping so many secrets. But then I look at his innocent little face, and I know I have no choice. He deserves a normal life, free from the burdens I carry. Ethan felt hot tears running down his cheeks. His mother's devotion was palpable in every word. But along with love, there was fear and guilt. What could be so terrible as to make her feel she had to protect him at all costs? As the night wore on, Ethan continued reading, absorbing every word, every emotion that his mother had entrusted to those pages. Gradually, he began to see beyond the secrets and mysteries to the woman behind them, a complex woman, full of love, fear, and courage. At some point, Ethan fell asleep with the diary still open on his chest. His dreams were a confusing mix of memories and fears, with the image of his mother always present, like a beacon in the darkness. When he woke up the next morning, Ethan felt a new determination growing inside him. He was going to find out the truth, not just for the secrets themselves, but to fully understand the woman his mother had been. Looking out of the window, he saw his father leaving for work, his shoulders slumped and his gait heavy. Ethan felt a pang of compassion that hadn't been there before. Perhaps it was time to try to reconnect with his father, to find a way through this storm of pain and secrets together. With a deep sigh, Ethan stood up. The day had only just begun, and there was a lot to be done. The ghosts of the past still haunted him, but now he was determined to face them, not just for himself, but for everyone he loved. As the sun rose in the sky, casting a golden light over the awakening city, Ethan felt a mixture of fear and hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time since his mother's death, he felt truly ready to face it. The dim light of dawn seeped through the curtains of Ethan's room, finding him already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his mother's diary open on his lap. Deep circles marked his face, silent witnesses to the sleepless nights that had accumulated since the diary's discovery. Her fingers ran over the yellowed pages, searching for more clues, more answers. But the more he read, the more questions arose. One entry in particular caught his attention. "I saw Sarah with that man again today. My heart squeezes at the thought of the danger she's in. If only she knew. But I can't tell her. Not yet. There's too much at stake." Ethan frowned, rereading the passage several times. Which man was this? And why did his mother seem so worried? Determined to find answers, Ethan decided it was time to dig deeper into Sarah's life. He knew he was treading on dangerous ground, potentially betraying his best friend's trust. But the need to understand what had happened to his mother outweighed any hesitation. With a heavy sigh, Ethan got up and dressed quickly. He had a plan, although he wasn't proud of it. Sarah worked in a coffee shop in the city center in the mornings. This would give him a few hours to search her apartment without being interrupted. The walk to Sarah's apartment was an internal battle for Ethan. Every step was accompanied by a voice in his head that questioned whether he was doing the right thing. But the image of his mother, the secrets in her diary, and the pain of loss drove him on. Arriving at the building, Ethan used the spare key that Sarah had given him years ago, in a moment of trust that now seemed so distant. The apartment was silent, the rays of the morning sun dancing on the familiar furniture. Ethan began his search methodically, trying not to leave anything out of place. Drawers, cupboards, even under the mattress. Nothing escaped his scrutiny. It was just as he was about to give up that he noticed something strange. A loose floorboard, barely visible under the living room carpet. His heart racing, Ethan lifted the board, revealing a small compartment. Inside, he found a folder of documents and a USB stick. His hands trembled as he opened the folder, revealing a series of photos and newspaper clippings. The photos showed Sarah with a man Ethan didn't recognize. He was older, with a hard face and cold eyes. In some pictures, they seemed to be arguing. In others, exchanging something Ethan couldn't identify. The newspaper clippings talked about a series of unsolved crimes in the city. Mysterious disappearances, suspicious business dealings, accusations of corruption. One name came up again and again. Victor Mendez. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. The name was unfamiliar to him, but the way it was linked to all these dark events was undeniable. And now, somehow, Sarah was involved with this man. Carefully stowing everything back in its hiding place, Ethan left the apartment, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He needed air, he needed to think. His steps took him to the park where he and Sarah used to play as children. Sitting on a worn bench, Ethan watched the families and couples strolling by, oblivious to the drama unfolding in his life. It was then that a memory hit him full force. An old video his mother used to watch, a party from years ago. Ethan remembered seeing his mother chatting animatedly with a woman he didn't know. At the time, he hadn't taken any notice, but now, with a sudden urgency, Ethan rushed back home. He rummaged through old boxes of tapes and DVDs until he found what he was looking for. A homemade DVD labeled simply Summer Party 2005. Putting the disc in the player, Ethan watched with renewed attention. And there it was, his mother, younger and more carefree, laughing and chatting with a dark-haired, bright-eyed woman. The conversation seemed intense, despite the smiles. Ethan paused the video, studying the unknown woman's face. There was something familiar about her, something he couldn't decipher. Who was she? And what was her connection to his mother? Determined to find out, Ethan decided to visit the place where the party had taken place. It was an old country house on the outskirts of town, now transformed into a small local museum. The museum was almost empty when Ethan arrived. He wandered through the corridors, looking at the exhibits about the town's history, but his mind was focused on something else. It was just as he was about to leave that he heard a voice behind him. "Can I help you with something, young man?" Ethan turned to find an elderly woman smiling kindly at him. Her name tag identified her as Maria, curator. "Actually," Ethan began hesitantly, "I'm looking for information about a party that took place here about 20 years ago. Summer 2005. Maria's eyes lit up with recognition. "Ah, yes, the museum's grand opening party. I was there, you know. It was quite an event." Ethan's heart raced. "Do you remember a woman who was there? Dark hair, bright eyes. She was talking to my mother, Amanda Collins." Maria frowned thoughtfully. "Amanda Collins. Oh, yes, I remember her. A lovely woman. And the other one, let me see." Her eyes suddenly widened. "Oh, you must be talking about Elena Vasquez. They were inseparable that night." Ethan felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Elena Vasquez. Finally, a name for the mysterious face. "Do you know anything else about her? About her relationship with my mother?" Maria smiled sadly. "They seemed very close, almost like sisters. But you know, it's funny. After that night, I never saw Elena around here again. And her mother, well, she seemed different the few times I saw her after that. More reserved, perhaps." Ethan thanked Maria, his mind spinning with this new information. As he walked back home, he felt he was finally getting close to something important. Elena Vasquez, Victor Mendez, Sarah. All these pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, although the full picture was still hazy. Arriving home, Ethan found his father sitting in the living room, staring at a photo of his mother. For a moment, he hesitated, torn between his desire to continue his investigation and the need to connect with his father. "Dad?" Ethan called out softly. His father looked at him, his eyes tired and red. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I know I haven't been around much lately." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "It's okay, Dad. I understand." They were silent for a moment, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. "Dad," Ethan finally said, "did you know a woman called Elena Vasquez?" His father paled visibly, his eyes widening in shock. Where did you hear that name?" And at that moment, Ethan knew he had touched something profound, something that could finally unravel the mysteries surrounding his mother's life and death. As the sun set outside, father and son sat down, ready for a long-delayed conversation. The shadows of the past were beginning to fade, and Ethan knew that for better or worse, nothing would be the same after tonight. The silence in the Collins living room was almost palpable. Ethan watched his father, noticing every wrinkle of concern, every subtle tremor in his hands. The name Elena Vasquez had acted like a key, unlocking a door his father had kept closed for so long. "Son," began Mr. Collins, his voice hoarse with emotion, "there are things about your mother, about our family, that I hoped I would never have to tell you." Ethan felt his heart race. "Dad, please. I need to know the truth." Mr. Collins closed his eyes for a moment, as if to gather his courage. When he opened them again, they were brimming with tears. "Elena Vasquez was your mother's best friend at college. They were inseparable, almost like sisters. But Elena, she always had a dark side, an attraction to danger that her mother didn't share." Ethan listened intently, absorbing every word. "After we got married, your mother and Elena drifted apart. I thought it was natural, you know. People go their separate ways. But then, at that party in 2005, Mr. Collins paused, his mind clearly reliving that night. Elena reappeared, and with her she brought trouble. She was involved with dangerous people, Ethan. People who wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone who stood in their way." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. "What kind of people, Dad?" "Criminals. drug dealers, people who handled sensitive information and had no scruples. Mr. Collins sighed heavily. Elena asked your mother for help. She said she was in danger, that she needed a place to hide. Ethan's mind spun. It all seemed so far removed from the image he had of his mother, the gentle, loving woman who had raised him. And Mom helped? Ethan asked, although he already suspected the answer. Mr. Collins nodded slowly. Your mother had a huge heart, Ethan. She couldn't see someone in danger and do nothing. But by helping Elena, she put us on the radar of these dangerous people. Ethan felt a wave of pride mixed with fear. His mother, brave and compassionate to the end. That's when we met Sarah, continued Mr. Collins, surprising Ethan. Sarah? My Sarah? Yes. Sarah was, well, she was the daughter of one of the men involved in this criminal network, Victor Mendez. The name hit Ethan like a punch in the gut. The man in the photos, the name in the newspaper clippings. Sarah was trying to escape this life. She turned to her mother, begging for help. And of course, Amanda couldn't refuse. Ethan was trying to process it all. His best friend, the girl he'd known since childhood, had such a deep and dark connection to his family. But Dad, what does all this have to do with Mom's death? Mr. Collins paled visibly. Your mother, she discovered something big. She was gathering information, evidence that could bring down this whole criminal network. But someone found out. Ethan felt his heart sink. Are you saying that? Yes, son. Your mother didn't die in an accident. She was murdered. Ethan's world seemed to crumble. All the suspicions, all the fears he had harbored ever since he found his mother's diary, suddenly confirmed in the most brutal way possible. And Sarah? Ethan asked, his voice almost a whisper. Did she know all this? Mr. Collins hesitated. Sarah. She's in a tricky position, Ethan. She knows things, yes, but she's also in danger. Her father, Victor, is not a man who forgives easily. Ethan stood up abruptly, anger and confusion bubbling in his chest. I need to talk to her, now. Ethan, wait! His father called out, but Ethan was already on his way out the door. The drive to Sarah's apartment was a blur. Ethan barely remembered driving, his mind a whirlwind of emotions and unanswered questions. When he finally arrived, he knocked hard on the door, his heart hammering in his chest. Sarah opened the door, her eyes widening at the sight of Ethan. Ethan? What? But before she could finish, Ethan interrupted her. No more lies, Sarah. I know about your father. I know about Elena Vasquez. I know about my mother. Sarah paled, taking a step back. Ethan, Why, Sarah? Ethan asked, his voice shaking with emotion. Why didn't you ever tell me? Sarah pulled him inside, closing the door quickly. Her eyes were full of tears, her whole body trembling. I wanted to tell you, Ethan. God knows I wanted to, but... She hesitated, looking around as if she feared someone might be listening. It's not safe. It's never been safe. Ethan watched her, seeing for the first time the weight she was carrying. The girl he had known since childhood, his best friend, suddenly seemed so fragile and frightened. Sarah, please, he begged. I need to know the truth, all of it. Sarah took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. My father. He's not a good man, Ethan. The things he did, the people he hurt. I grew up seeing it all, wanting to run away, but not knowing how. She paused, tears streaming down her face. Your mother was the first person who really tried to help me. She risked everything for me, Ethan. And I loved her for it. Ethan felt his anger dissipating, replaced by a deep sadness. What happened that night, Sarah? The night my mother... Sarah closed her eyes, the pain evident in every line of her face. Your mother had proof. Evidence that could put my father and his entire organization in jail. She was going to hand it over to the police the next morning. Ethan felt his heart squeeze. But someone found out. Sarah nodded, sobbing. My father found out. I tried to warn your mother, Ethan. I swear I tried. But I was too late. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stared at Sarah, his mind struggling to reconcile the girl he knew with the shocking revelations he had just heard. Why did you stay? Ethan finally asked. Why stay here, knowing all this? Sarah looked him in the eye, a fierce determination shining through her tears. Because I promised your mother that I would finish what she started. I'm gathering evidence, Ethan. Evidence that will bring down my father and his entire organization. Ethan felt a mixture of admiration and fear. Sarah, this is too dangerous. If your father finds out... I know the risks, she interrupted, but I owe it to your mother. I owe it to you. At that moment, looking at Sarah, Ethan saw not just her best friend, but a warrior, carrying a burden that no one should carry alone. You're not alone anymore, Sarah, he said, taking her hands in his. Let's finish this together, for my mother. Sarah looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and fear in her eyes. Ethan, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. Maybe not, he replied, but I know I can't stand by while you risk everything. We're a team, remember? A small smile appeared on Sarah's face, the first Ethan had seen in days. A team, she repeated softly. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the room, Ethan and Sarah stood there, united by a bond stronger than blood, a bond forged by truth, shared pain, and the promise of justice. The journey ahead would be dangerous, full of challenges they could barely imagine. But in that moment, with the truth finally exposed and a shared purpose, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt for a long time. Hope. The morning arrived with a dense fog enveloping the city, as if nature itself was trying to hide the secrets Ethan and Sarah had unearthed. Ethan woke up on his sofa, his neck sore from the uncomfortable position. He and Sarah had spent the whole night planning their next move, discussing every detail, every possible scenario. Sarah's apartment now looked like a makeshift investigation center. Maps, photos, and documents covered every available surface. In the center of it all, a photo of Ethan's mother smiled serenely, like a silent reminder of what was at stake. Ethan stood up, rubbing his tired eyes. Sarah was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with an untouched cup of coffee in front of her, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "Did you get any sleep?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse with sleep. Sarah shook her head negatively. "I didn't. I keep thinking, what if we don't make it? What if it's too late?" Ethan sat down next to her, putting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's not too late. We'll make it, Sarah. Together." She looked at him, a small smile forming on her lips. "How can you be so optimistic after everything you've discovered?" Ethan reflected for a moment. "I think it's because I finally understand. I understand why my mother did what she did, why you made your choices. And now we have the chance to do the right thing." The sound of a notification on Sarah's cell phone broke the moment. She picked up the device, her eyes widening as she read the message. "It's her," Sarah whispered. "Elena Vasquez. She wants to meet us." Ethan felt his heart race. Elena Vasquez, his mother's friend, the woman who seemed to be at the center of it all. "When? Where?" "This afternoon, in the old warehouse near the port." Ethan frowned. "It looks dangerous." Sarah nodded. "It is, but it may be our only chance of getting the missing evidence." The next few hours were a blur of preparations. They reviewed all the information they had, planned escape routes, even considered informing the police. But in the end, They decided that they needed to do this alone, at least for the time being. When the time finally came, Ethan and Sarah found themselves standing in front of the old warehouse. The building stood against the gray sky, its rusty metal walls telling silent stories of better days. "Ready?" Ethan asked, his voice betraying a slight tremor. Sarah took a deep breath. "As ready as I can be." They entered together, the creak of the door echoing in the empty space. The interior of the warehouse was a maze of stacked boxes and abandoned machinery. The dim light coming through the dirty windows created unsettling shadows. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his voice reverberating off the metal walls. For a moment, only silence answered. Then a female voice emerged from the shadows. "Ethan Collins, you look just like your mother." Elena Vasquez emerged from the darkness. She was exactly as Ethan remembered from the video, although the years had left their mark. Her eyes, however, still shone with an almost feverish intensity. "Ms. Vasquez," Ethan began, but she interrupted him with a gesture. "Elena, please. Your mother was my best friend. You're practically family." Sarah stepped forward. "Elena, we need to know everything," Elena added, a sad smile on her lips. "You need to know everything, and I'm going to tell you. But first you need to understand something. What you're about to hear will change your lives forever. Are you sure you're ready?" Ethan and Sarah exchanged glances. In that silent moment, an entire conversation took place. Fear, determination, confidence, all passing between them in an instant. "We're ready," Ethan answered for both of them. Elena nodded, guiding them to a brighter area of the warehouse. There, a makeshift table was covered in papers and photos. "It all started over 20 years ago," Elena began, her voice heavy with emotion. "Your mother and I were young, idealistic. We wanted to change the world." She picked up an old photo showing two smiling women on a university campus. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest at the sight of his mother, so young and full of life. "But then," Elena continued, "we discovered something big, a network of corruption that stretched from the highest echelons of government to the streets. Drug trafficking, money laundering, murder." Sarah paled. "My father?" Elena nodded gravely. Victor Mendez was just one piece of the puzzle, but an important one. Ethan felt his head spin with the implications. "And my mother? She was investigating all this?" "Yes," Elena confirmed. "Amanda was brilliant, Ethan. She managed to connect the dots that no one else saw, but that put her in danger." "Why didn't you help her?" Ethan asked, a hint of accusation in his voice. Elena lowered her eyes, the guilt evident on her face. "I tried to at first, but I got scared. I pulled back. It's something I've lived with every day since." Sarah put a hand on Ethan's arm, a silent gesture of support. "What happened the night Ethan's mother died?" Elena took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. Amanda had gathered all the evidence. She was going to expose everything. But someone leaked the information. By the time I got to warn her, it was too late. Tears were streaming down Elena's face now. Ethan felt his own vision blur, the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "But the evidence," Sarah insisted. "What happened to them?" A small smile appeared on Elena's face. "Your mother was clever, Ethan. She hid everything, in a place that only someone who knew her well could find." Ethan felt his heart leap. "Where?" Elena looked straight into Ethan's eyes. "Think, Ethan. What was your mother's favorite place, where she felt safest?" The answer came like lightning. "The lake house," Ethan whispered. "The cabin where we spent our summers." Elena nodded, a gleam of approval in her eyes. "Exactly. Everything we need to bring down this organization is there. but we need to act fast. They're getting closer." As if to emphasize his words, the sound of tires screeching outside echoed through the warehouse. Elena paled. "They've found us," she whispered. "You need to go, now." "What about you?" Sarah asked, panic evident in her voice. Elena smiled sadly. "My part in this story is coming to an end. But you can finish it. You can do it justice." Ethan hesitated, reluctant to leave Elena behind. But the sound of approaching voices made him make a decision. "Come on, Sarah," he shouted, taking her hand. They ran through the labyrinthine corridors of the warehouse, Ethan's heart hammering in his ears. Behind them, they heard screams and the sound of things being knocked over. When they finally emerged into daylight, Ethan pulled Sarah into the car. They set off at high speed, leaving behind the warehouse and, Ethan feared, Elena. As they drove towards the old cabin on the lake, the silence in the car was heavy. Ethan looked at Sarah, seeing the fear and determination in her eyes. "We're going to make it," he said, more to himself than to her. "We're going to finish what my mother started." Sarah nodded, squeezing Ethan's hand. Together. The road stretched ahead of them, taking them towards an uncertain future. But for the first time since this whole journey began, Ethan felt that they were on the right path. The road to truth, to justice, and perhaps to redemption. The road that led to the lake cabin snaked between tall, dense trees, each bend seeming like a shadow of what was to come. Ethan drove steadily, but his mind was racing, filled with thoughts of his mother, Sarah, and what might be lurking in the cabin. Elena's revelation had left him in a state of nerves, but his determination to keep his promise to his mother kept him focused. "Do you think Elena will be all right?" Sarah asked, her voice tense beside him. Ethan hesitated. "I hope so. But right now we need to focus on what comes next." When they reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, dyeing the sky a deep, dramatic red. The wooden structure seemed almost magical, with the smell of the lake and the surrounding forest bringing back memories of childhood. But today, the place that was supposed to be a refuge was now a battlefield. "Come on, we've got to get in," Ethan exclaimed, jumping out of the car and running towards the door. Sarah followed him, her gaze nervously scanning the surrounding landscape, as if she feared someone might be hiding among the trees. The door creaked open, revealing the familiar but dusty interior. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows, illuminating the space with a soft light. Ethan remembered all the summers spent there, laughing and playing. But now, nostalgia was quickly replaced by urgency. "She said the evidence is here," Ethan said, his voice echoing in the empty room. "We need to look." They split up, searching every corner of the cabin. Ethan headed for his mother's bedroom, rummaging through drawers and examining every object. The diary was still there, but he ignored it for the moment. What mattered was the evidence that could bring down the criminal network and bring justice. Sarah was in the kitchen opening cupboards and checking under the sink. "Ethan, look at this," she shouted, her voice full of emotion. Ethan rushed over to her, finding her on her knees, examining a wooden box that was hidden in the back of a cupboard. The box was covered in dust, but when Sarah pulled it out, Ethan could see that it was locked. "It has a lock," Sarah observed, frustration in her voice, "and we don't have the key." "What if the key is here?" Ethan replied, looking around. "Let's look." They searched the kitchen, but the key seemed to have disappeared. Ethan's anxiety began to rise. Time was running out, and the thought of failing in his mission was unbearable. "Let's check the diary," Ethan suggested, his voice trembling with anticipation. She might have left a clue in there. In the bedroom, Ethan picked up his mother's diary, flipping through the pages until he found an entry that talked about the box. "I've hidden something very important in the cabin," he read aloud. "Something that can protect not only my family, but other innocent people who might be affected by those who wish to do harm. If something happens to me, which I hope it won't. The key is in a place where I've always sought shelter." "A place where I've always sought shelter," Sarah repeated, her eyes shining with realization. "Do you think she was talking about the lake?" "Could be," Ethan replied, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Let's go." They ran towards the lake, their minds buzzing with possibilities. The place was sacred to them, a haven where their mother used to take them fishing and swimming. Now, however, Ethan felt like an intruder in what had once been a space of happiness. "She must have hidden the key somewhere in here," Ethan said, looking around frantically. "But where?" "Maybe in the stone she used to use as a seat," Sarah suggested, pointing to a large rock at the edge of the lake. "What if it is?" Ethan replied. "Let's check it out." They ran over to the rock and started searching, turning over the earth and examining every crack. Finally, Ethan saw something glinting in the sunlight. "There!" he shouted, pointing. "I think I've found it." He bent down and pulled out a small metal box, which contained an old, rusty key. Ethan's heart raced. That must be it. With the key in hand, they rushed back to the hut, excitement and anxiety mixing. Ethan hurried to open the wooden box. "I hope this works," he muttered, inserting the key into the lock. With a satisfying click, the box opened, revealing a pile of documents, photos, and a small USB memory stick. "That's everything," Sarah exclaimed, looking at the contents with wide eyes. Ethan began leafing through the documents, his heart sinking with each page. There were records of transactions, names of people involved in the criminal network, and even photos of victims. But at the bottom of the box, a folder caught his eye. He pulled out the folder, and when he opened it, he was paralyzed. Inside was a photo of his mother with Elena, but there was also a photo of Sarah, and a shadowy figure in the background. A man Ethan recognized immediately. Victor Mendez. "Sarah!" he shouted, showing her the photo. "Look!" Sarah put her hand to her mouth, her face pale. "No, that can't be." "But it is. He was here. He was watching." At the same moment, a noise echoed outside the hut, and Ethan's heart raced. "They're here," he whispered, his gaze frantic. "We need to get out," Sarah said, pulling Ethan towards the door. But before they could reach the exit, the door opened with a bang, revealing Victor Mendez and two of his men. Victor's smile was grim, his intentions obvious. "Surprise," he said, his voice as smooth as silk, but with a menacing tone. "It seems you were very busy. I was really hoping you'd show up." Ethan and Sarah paled, adrenaline coursing through their veins. "What do you want, Victor?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "From the looks of it, what I want is to put an end to this little game you've been calling justice," he replied, his gaze fixed on Sarah. "You should have learned to stay away from certain subjects, dear." "I won't let you hurt anyone," Sarah shouted, gripping Ethan's hand tightly. Victor laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "You have no choice, and now you two are going to join the party." Ethan felt his fear turn to anger. He couldn't allow Victor to take Sarah or the evidence his mother had collected to fall into the wrong hands. "No! We have to fight!" Ethan shouted, pulling Sarah behind him. "Staying here will only make things worse," Victor said, his men advancing. "You'd better surrender." But before they could be contained, something unexpected happened. A gunshot echoed through the air, and one of Victor's men fell to the ground. Surprised, Ethan looked around, searching for the source of the shot. On the other side of the hut, a group of police officers appeared, led by an officer Ethan recognized, Dr. Marcus. "Police! Stay where you are," the officer shouted. Victor immediately turned around, his smile disappearing. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he shouted, but it was too late. The police surrounded him, and confusion took over. As the scene unfolded, Ethan felt a wave of relief mixed with confusion. The truth they were seeking was finally close to being revealed, but tension still hung in the air. "What's going on?" Ethan asked Dr. Marcus, who approached quickly. "We received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity here," he explained. "And after investigating, we discovered that Victor Mendez was behind a criminal network. We're ready to take you all in." "But the evidence!" Sarah exclaimed. "We need to make sure they're used." Dr. Marcus nodded. "We're with you. What do you have in the box?" Ethan and Sarah quickly showed the documents and the USB memory stick to Dr. Marcus, who quickly examined the contents. "That's gold," he said, his expression turning serious. "With this, we can finally dismantle this organization." As the police took Victor and his men away, Ethan and Sarah found themselves in a whirlwind of emotions. The adrenaline was still coursing through their veins, but now there was a new feeling: hope. Dr. Marcus approached, his expression serious but relieved. "You've done a great job," he said, looking at the documents Ethan was holding. "With this, we can finally dismantle this organization." "But what about Elena?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "She stayed behind." "She knew the risks," Dr. Marcus replied, "and she did what she could to help you. Now, we need to make sure that the evidence is used correctly." Ethan nodded, but concern for Elena still weighed heavily on his heart. He knew the fight wasn't over. With Victor in custody, the organization could retaliate, and Elena was still in danger. "We need to find her," Ethan said, his determination renewed. "She deserves justice as much as my mother does." Dr. Marcus looked at Ethan, admiring his courage. "You're right. We will do it. But we need to be careful. The last thing we want is to put more people at risk." As the police officers organized the scene, Ethan and Sarah stood back a little, trying to process everything that had happened. The weight of the truth was finally beginning to settle on them, but the sense of relief was overshadowed by worry. "Do you think she'll be all right?" Sarah asked, looking at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. "I hope so," Ethan replied, feeling a lump in his throat. "She's strong, and if we get the evidence, maybe we can protect her." "We need to act fast," Sarah insisted. "Victor isn't going to stay in prison forever, and he won't stop until everyone who threatens his organization is eliminated." With a plan in mind, they headed to the local police station, where the evidence would be delivered. The drive was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about his mother and how she had risked everything to protect those she loved. When they arrived at the police station, they were met by a group of officers who led them into an interrogation room. Dr. Marcus began to explain the situation, while Ethan and Sarah looked on nervously. "These documents are crucial," Dr. Marcus said, pointing to the table where the evidence was laid out. "With these, we can not only arrest Victor, but also dismantle the entire criminal network." Ethan felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. "What about Elena? What are we going to do for her?" "We're going to do everything we can to find her," Dr. Marcus replied. "But we need to proceed with caution. If Victor has allies, they could be lurking." As the conversation continued, Ethan decided that he couldn't stand idly by. He had to do something. "I'm going to find Elena," he said, his voice firm. "She needs me." "You can't do this alone," Sarah intervened, worried. "It's too dangerous." "I know, but I can't leave her behind. She risked everything for us. Now it's our turn to help her." Dr. Marcus looked at Ethan, assessing his determination. "If you really want to do this, we'll need a plan. We can't act impulsively." Ethan nodded, his mind already working on a plan. "We need to find out where Victor might have hidden Elena. If she's in danger, we need to find her before it's too late." "I can help," Sarah said, her voice full of determination. "I know some people who can give us information about the organization. If Victor has allies, they might know where she is." With a plan in mind, Ethan and Sarah separated from Dr. Marcus and began to investigate. They spent hours making calls, talking to contacts, and trying to find any clue that could lead them to Elena. Finally, an anonymous call led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. "It's now or never," Ethan said, his determination renewed. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Sarah asked hesitantly. "Yes, I can't leave Elena behind. She needs us," Ethan replied, his voice firm. They reached the warehouse, their hearts pounding in their chests. The structure was dark and silent, but Ethan sensed that something was about to happen. They entered, the dim light illuminating the dusty space. "Elena!" Ethan called out, his voice echoing off the walls. "We're here!" A heavy silence followed, and Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. But then a familiar voice answered. "Ethan? Sarah?" Elena appeared from the shadows, her face pale but determined. "You've come." "We're here to help you," Ethan said, relieved to see her. "We have the evidence. Let's get this over with." But before they could gather themselves, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Victor Mendez and his men appeared, surrounding them. "I knew you wouldn't give up," Victor said, a cruel smile on his face. "But that ends here." Ethan felt the adrenaline rush through his veins. "We won't let you hurt anyone." "Ah, but you have no choice," Victor replied, gesturing to his men. "You're at a disadvantage." But before they could act, a siren sounded in the distance, and the police began to surround the warehouse. The tension in the air was palpable. "Police! Everybody down!" shouted an officer, and the scene quickly turned into chaos. Ethan and Sarah took advantage of the confusion to move towards Elena, while the officers confronted Victor and his men. The warehouse was in a state of disarray, but Ethan's determination was unwavering. "Let's go!" he shouted, pulling Elena away from the confusion. As the policemen arrested Victor and his men, Ethan felt a wave of relief. They had succeeded. The truth was finally being revealed, and justice was within reach. "Thank you for coming," Elena said, her voice shaking. "I didn't know if I'd make it out of this." "We're in this together," Ethan replied, looking into her eyes. "And now, let's make sure it never happens again." With the evidence in hand and Victor finally arrested, Ethan and Sarah knew the fight wasn't over yet. But now, they had allies and the determination to do what was right. As they left the warehouse, Ethan looked up at the sky, where the stars were beginning to shine. He felt that, despite all the difficulties, there was hope. His mother's memory guided him, and he was determined to honor her legacy. "Let's do this together," Sarah said, holding Ethan's hand. "For your mother." "For my mother," Ethan agreed, a smile of determination on his face. And so, with the truth finally revealed and justice within their grasp, Ethan, Sarah, and Elena prepared to face the future. The journey had been long and full of challenges, but together, they were ready for whatever came next. Did this narrative stir your emotions? Don't forget to express your approval with a like. Take advantage of the Super Thanks feature, available just below the video, to offer direct support to the channel and contribute to the production of more fascinating content. Subscribe and remember to activate the bell to stay up to date with all the latest updates. And attention, a new exciting story is already ready to be displayed on your screen. Your participation means a lot to me, and I hope to count on your presence soon. Thank you very much for dedicating your time to this video.